It was one of those gray New England afternoons where the air held that quiet chill, the kind that settles into your skin without you noticing. It was April 2nd, 2011, a Saturday, and Layla Hart had no intention of being gone long. She told her mom she just needed to run to Ridgeway Mall to return a sweater she'd bought the week before, maybe grab a smoothie if the line wasn't bad. She said she'd be back before dinner. It was the kind of errand people run 100 times, the kind you don't even think twice about. Layla was 23, living at home again after finishing college, working part-time at a nearby daycare while looking for full-time work. She was quiet, the kind of young woman who preferred books over bars, with a steady schedule and a soft routine. Ridgeway Mall was less than 10 minutes from their house. It wasn't much anymore, just a half-empty indoor mall clinging to old anchor stores and dim overhead lighting. But it was familiar. Safe enough that no one worried when she left alone around 4 p.m. Her mother remembered watching her drive off. She wore a gray hoodie, black leggings, and her favorite canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder. It was still light out. Layla parked near the east entrance just after 4:15 p.m., according to the timestamp on the exterior security camera. She locked her car and walked in through the automatic doors. That was the last time anyone would see her with certainty. By 6:30, dinner was ready. Her mom texted once, then again. No reply. The smoothie place closed at 7, and Ridgeway itself wasn't a place you lingered in after dark. By 7:15, Layla's phone went straight to voicemail. Her parents waited longer than they now wish they had. They called her friends. They called the neighbor she sometimes drove around with. Then, around 8:30 p.m., they drove to the mall themselves. Her car was still there. Same parking spot, same angle, windows up, doors locked. Nothing inside looked disturbed. Her mom said she felt her knees go weak just looking at it. They walked the mall, store by store. They asked bored teenagers working the counters if anyone had seen a girl in a gray hoodie. A security guard radioed the supervisor. By 9:30, local police were on scene, taking statements, unlocking the car, and beginning what they initially considered a welfare check. Police pulled surveillance footage from the interior and exterior cameras. Ridgeway had roughly a dozen functioning feeds, most in public areas, entrances, main walkways, and anchor stores. Layla was seen entering the mall alone at 4:17 p.m. She stopped briefly at a clearance rack in a department store. At 4:38, she walked past a frozen yogurt kiosk. At 4:44, she headed toward the back hallway near the old movie theater and maintenance corridor. Then, nothing. No footage showed her exiting. No camera caught her heading toward another wing. There was no sign of her after that hallway. Police noted a 5-minute gap in one, the service corridor feeds, the kind of thing that might have gone unnoticed under normal circumstances. Mall staff claimed it was a routine glitch. Investigators weren't so sure. Layla's purse was found in her bedroom, so she'd only taken her phone, ID, and the sweater she planned to return. There were no recent bank charges. Her cell records showed no outgoing texts or calls after 4:23 p.m. No pings, no social media activity. It was like someone had flipped a switch. The initial assumption was that she'd left with someone. A boyfriend, maybe. A friend. But everyone who knew her insisted there was no one. She hadn't been dating. She hadn't been in any kind of trouble. She wasn't impulsive, and she didn't like surprises. There were no mental health red flags. She didn't drink, didn't drive far, didn't even like elevators. By midnight, missing persons flyers were being printed. Officers canvassed the surrounding neighborhoods. A dive team searched the retention pond behind the loading dock. Nothing. By morning, the case had already started to feel different. The media picked it up Monday. Young woman disappears from local mall. No witnesses, no evidence. Inside the Hart house, nothing made sense. Her room was untouched, her laundry half folded. There was a grocery list on the fridge in her handwriting, dated for Sunday. Her mom found a receipt in the trash from the pet store. Dog treats, bought the day before. Everyone had the same question. How does someone vanish inside a building? In a mall with cameras and staff and stores still open? How does a person go in and not come out, with no scream, no struggle, no trace? In the coming days, Police would expand the search radius, bring in dogs, and comb every inch of Ridgeway Mall, or at least every inch they thought mattered. But that night, all anyone knew was that Layla Hart walked into a place she'd been dozens of times before, and never came back out. And somewhere, in the blank space between one hallway and the next, something had gone very, very wrong. The Monday after Layla disappeared, investigators requested full access to Ridgeway Mall's security system. They wanted everything, every angle, every second of recorded footage from every camera still operating that weekend. It wasn't a large mall, not anymore. It had been in slow decline for years. Half the stores were vacant. The food court barely stayed open past 5. But there were still enough active cameras to create a timeline, and that's exactly what detectives hoped to build, a minute-by-minute path of Layla's movements. She entered at 4:17 p.m. through the east entrance. The footage showed her walking calmly, alone, no one following. She paused at a display of cell phone cases, lingered at a clearance rack in a department store, and was seen buying a smoothie at 4:32. She sipped it while walking past a nail salon and headed down the south corridor, the one leading toward the old movie theater, now closed and boarded up. At 4:44, a camera caught her turning left down a short hallway. That was the last image of her on any working feed. There should have been another angle. A security camera had been installed above the entrance to the elevator hallway, covering both the service corridor and a locked access door leading to staff-only areas. According to the system's digital log, the camera had lost signal from 4:45 to 4:47 p.m., exactly the time Layla would have passed through. When the footage resumed, the hallway was empty. The camera's failure was chalked up by mall staff as a routine glitch. Old wiring, they said. It happens sometimes. But it didn't sit right. Of the dozen active cameras in the mall, this was the only one with any outage that weekend, and the 2-minute window of that outage aligned exactly with Layla's last known location. Detectives asked to see security maintenance records. That's when the second red flag appeared. The logs were inconsistent. Some entries were missing entirely. There was no documentation that the glitch had been reported at the time. In fact, the last maintenance check on that particular camera had been signed off 6 weeks earlier by someone who no longer worked there. A lieutenant reviewing the footage noticed something else. Near the corridor was an access door marked Maintenance, Authorized Staff Only. It was supposed to remain locked at all times, but during a walkthrough with mall personnel, the lock didn't engage. A gentle tug opened it. Inside was a narrow stairwell leading down to the sub-basement level, mostly used for utility access and old freight storage. It had been decades since that level saw any real use. When questioned, mall security claimed the door was usually locked, but acknowledged the key had gone missing months earlier. A replacement had been requested, but never installed. There were no surveillance cameras inside the sub-level, no alarms, just a dark concrete underlayer beneath a mostly forgotten mall. Then came the janitor. His name was Vernon Avery, mid-50s, quiet, worked nights. He'd been assigned to clean the service hallway that weekend. When interviewed, he told officers he hadn't seen Layla and hadn't cleaned that area until Sunday. But his shift report said otherwise, that he'd finished the hallway late Saturday night, around 9 p.m. When pressed, Vernon hesitated. He admitted to leaving early on Saturday, clocking out before he was supposed to, but didn't want to get in trouble. He claimed he never saw anything unusual. Still, inconsistencies were piling up. His story didn't match the time card. The hallway hadn't been properly cleaned. No fingerprints were found on the door handle, but that wasn't surprising. It had been touched by dozens of staff over the years, and the surface was worn. Detectives asked for badge logs. Ridgeway Mall used a digital key system for certain areas. Authorized personnel had to swipe badges to access restricted rooms, but the data was incomplete. According to the logs, no one had used a badge to access the back corridor all day Saturday, which simply wasn't possible. The janitor's badge didn't show any swipes. Neither did the one assigned to Jeff Loring, the part-time maintenance worker who had signed in earlier that morning but had left by the time Layla arrived. When police tried to track Loring down for clarification, they learned he hadn't returned to work. He had called in sick Monday, and by Tuesday, He had officially quit. His listed address led to a basement apartment 3 towns over, but by the time officers visited, he was already gone. Back at the station, the team rewatched the footage again and again, every second from every hallway. Nothing showed Layla leaving. Nothing suggested she ran. Nothing indicated a struggle. It was like she'd stepped into a hallway that no longer existed. Investigators considered whether she might have gone out a back door, but that seemed unlikely. The only exit near that hallway was for staff, and the alarm never triggered. Even if it had, she would have had to know the door was there, and it led to a fenced loading dock, not a main road. For the first time, detectives said it out loud. Something might have happened to her inside that building, something that left no trace. The Ridgeway Mall surveillance system, pieced together and decades behind, had left them with a timeline that stopped in the one place cameras didn't work. A corridor with no witnesses, a broken camera, a door that never locked, and 2 minutes of footage that never recorded. They didn't have proof of a crime. Not yet. But for the Hart family, something was already clear. Layla hadn't vanished into the air. She'd vanished into a blind spot. When detectives began interviewing Ridgeway Mall employees, it didn't take long for one name to surface more than once: Jeff Loring. He wasn't high on the radar at first, just a part-time maintenance worker, 29 years old, hired through a subcontractor. He worked odd hours, mostly evenings and weekends, quiet, kept to himself, but when asked whether he'd been working on the day Layla disappeared, his answer didn't match the time card. Loring claimed he'd clocked in around noon but had gone home early with a stomach bug, said he barely made it through lunch before asking to leave. But the system showed him clocking out at 4:48 p.m., within minutes of when Layla vanished near the service corridor. No one could verify if he'd actually left at that time. His supervisor didn't recall seeing him that day at all, and there was no security footage showing him leaving the premises. Then there was the issue of the keys. Months earlier, Loring had been quietly reprimanded after being found inside a closed tenant space that hadn't been used in years. When questioned, he claimed he was inspecting a leaking pipe, but security later learned he'd used a master key, one that was supposed to be locked in the facilities office. Management assumed it had been left out by mistake. The matter didn't go further, but now it was hard to ignore. Investigators searched his locker. It was mostly empty, except for a crumpled work shirt, a half-used roll of duct tape, and a ring of keys that didn't match the ones issued to his job level. Maintenance staff were only authorized for public utility spaces, but Loring's set included access to 2 restricted areas, one of them being the sub-basement behind the old freight elevator. Detectives questioned him formally 3 days after Layla's disappearance. He denied seeing her, said he hadn't been near the South Corridor that day. When asked about the sub-basement access, he got defensive, said everyone borrowed keys, nothing was locked properly anyway, and that he was being unfairly targeted. His tone shifted between indifference and irritation. Still, without physical evidence, there was no legal ground to detain him. They pressed harder on his alibi. He said he left after getting sick and had driven straight home, but no coworker recalled him mentioning illness, and his cell phone remained within tower range of the mall until nearly 6 p.m. He hadn't used it that day, which wasn't suspicious on its own, but it added to the pattern. There were no scratches, no blood, no fingerprints tying him to Layla's path. Nothing in his locker belonged to her. No items in his car or apartment stood out during the limited search officers were legally allowed to conduct. He had a past, 2 trespassing charges from 5 years back, both tied to abandoned buildings, but no violent history, no arrests for anything physical, nothing concrete. Still, the timing and location put him in the middle of a vanishing that had no other explanation. He had access. He had opportunity. But he left no trace. 3 days after the interview, Loring didn't show up for work. He didn't answer calls from his supervisor. By the end of the week, the subcontractor listed him as voluntarily terminated. Detectives tried to follow up, but by then, he was already gone. His apartment had been subleased to a cousin. A neighbor mentioned he packed a few bags and left in a rush, saying something vague about a family emergency out west. No forwarding address, no new place of employment. His phone was disconnected within days. They issued a request to speak with him again through public channels, but there was no legal reason to compel him. He wasn't a suspect, not formally, just someone with a troubling proximity to a moment they still couldn't explain. The mall was rechecked, the elevator examined, staff areas swept again, no sign of Layla, no indication of where she could have gone or what could have happened in the brief span of time when cameras blinked and silence fell. It was the first major stall in the case, an early burst of momentum grinding to a crawl under the weight of missing evidence. For Layla's family, it was maddening. A man with access to restricted areas, who clocked out the moment she disappeared, who had keys he shouldn't have had, who left town with no warning. And yet, he walked away. No charges, no warrant, just a name in a file and a line of questions that kept circling back to nothing. Investigators didn't forget him. Over the years, his name would come up again in status meetings. His photo remained pinned inside the case file. But without cause, without DNA, without video, there was nowhere to go. No piece to push forward, just a hole shaped like a man who may have known exactly where she went and had no reason to talk. And behind that corridor, the door still didn't lock. As the investigation dragged into its second week, attention returned to a part of the building that had barely been considered at first. The elevator at the far end of the south corridor, just beyond where the last footage of Layla had been captured. At first glance, it seemed irrelevant. Mall staff claimed it had been out of service that weekend, taped off and awaiting repair. Most assumed it hadn't played any role in Layla's disappearance. But when investigators asked to see the maintenance records, there were none. No service report, no technician signature, no entry log, and no work order showing it was scheduled for repair. The elevator wasn't new. It served as both a passenger and freight lift depending on the tenant's needs, a leftover feature from Ridgeway Mall's better days. In recent years, only staff used it, mostly for moving supply carts between levels or accessing storage. According to the building manager, it had been down for several weeks. But that didn't line up with witness statements. One employee from the mobile phone kiosk told police they'd used the elevator just days before Layla vanished. Another recalled hearing it operate that Friday. No one could say exactly when it stopped working, or if it ever really did. Detectives checked the internal logs from the elevator control system. One entry stood out. At 8:16 p.m. on the night Layla disappeared, nearly 4 hours after she'd last been seen, the emergency phone inside the elevator had connected to the mall's security line. The audio was recorded. At the time, it was logged and dismissed as a prank call. No follow-up was done. The recording was short, 23 seconds of static, followed by a garbled voice. Indistinct, like someone struggling to speak through a damaged microphone. There were no clear words, just noise, then a low thud, and silence. At the time, no one connected it to Layla. It was past closing, and the elevator was assumed to be locked down. Security never checked it. The call wasn't escalated. It was just filed away, forgotten, until investigators found it again. By then, the elevator had been reactivated. Mall traffic had slowed even further, but the unit had been restored to use without fanfare about 6 weeks after the disappearance. A basic inspection had been done by a contracted firm. No reports of malfunction, no blood, no damage, nothing unusual inside, just an aging elevator with scuffed floors and buzzing lights. But the question lingered. If Layla had somehow ended up inside that elevator, if she had panicked, tried to call for help and no one came, what might have happened next? Investigators requested a second inspection, this time with forensic detail. A cadaver dog was brought in. It gave no definitive alert, though one handler noted the dog paused near the lower shaft entry before moving on. Technicians scanned for DNA but found nothing conclusive. No fingerprints matched Layla, no hair, no fibers. If she'd been there, the evidence was long gone. The elevator's internal camera, if it ever had one, had been removed years earlier during budget cuts. There was no visual history to review, just the timeline, the corridor where she vanished, the elevator directly adjacent to it, and an emergency call no one ever answered. Ridgeway staff grew defensive. Some said it wasn't their fault, that the place had been neglected for years, that corners were always cut, that no one really knew how much of the building still functioned the way it was supposed to. Others quietly admitted it haunted them. The idea that maybe she was in there, maybe she had pressed that button and waited, and by the time anyone cared, she was already gone. Layla's mother fixated on that call. She asked to hear the audio herself. Police declined, but a transcript summary was given. She read it over and over. Unintelligible female voice, panic, possible cry for help, unconfirmed. It became the sentence that replayed in her head each time she returned to the mall parking lot. Detectives added it to the case file. One more inconsistency, one more question without an answer. No one could say how she might have gotten inside if the elevator was supposedly out of order. No one could explain why it made a call if it wasn't powered, and no one could prove she'd ever stepped into it at all. But what stuck with investigators wasn't the malfunction. It was the timing. The last known sighting of Layla, 4:44 p.m. The call, 8:16 p.m., nearly 4 hours unaccounted for, inside a building with blind spots, faulty locks, and staff who didn't ask questions. There was no sign of a struggle, no body, no blood. But there was a door and a box and a call for help buried in static that no one responded to. And if Layla had pressed that button and waited, they would never know how long she was in there before she stopped. By the time the news stopped covering it, Janet Hart was already in a rhythm. Every Saturday morning she drove to Ridgeway Mall with a fresh stack of flyers. Same photo, Layla in her college. Sweatshirt, hair pulled back, soft smile. Same message. Missing since April 2nd, 2011, last seen at Ridgeway Mall. Please help. At first, people still asked about her. Passers-by would pause, recognize her face from the television reports, offer a hand on the arm, a quiet word. But eventually, fewer noticed, and fewer still remembered. By 2013, many of the stores were gone. The bookstore closed. So did the shoe place, the arcade, the little shop that sold candles and strange kitchen gadgets. Ridgeway Mall was unraveling. But Janet didn't care. She wasn't there to shop. She walked the same route every time, east entrance, south corridor, past the smoothie counter now shuttered in dust, down the hall where the elevator still groaned when it moved. She would replace any weathered flyer. She kept a list of stores still open, who allowed them, who took them down. Security didn't stop her anymore. Most of them were new hires rotating through. They recognized her face, nodded, and let her pass. Sometimes she stood in the food court just to listen. She watched people come and go, looking for someone who might seem out of place, someone who avoided her eyes, someone who lingered near the corridor and then turned away. Her husband had stopped coming, her son too. For them, life had to keep moving. But Janet didn't see it that way. For her, time stayed pinned to a single hour. She still made dinner for 3. She still folded Layla's sweaters. She still checked the case log whenever a new detective took over, which was often. And in her mind, Ridgeway Mall still held something no one else had found. One holiday season, near the end of 2015, Janet noticed something that hadn't been there before. Near the corridor, the one where the elevator sat, the one police had searched and researched, a side hallway door had been left slightly open. She froze when she saw it. It wasn't new. In fact, she remembered seeing it years ago, sealed and painted over. Staff only. She'd asked about it back in 2011, and mall management told her it was permanently closed off. Utility access, nothing there. But now it stood ajar, maybe 2 inches, no lock, no sign, just a narrow view into shadow. She didn't go inside. She didn't touch it. Instead, she pulled a pen from her bag and wrote the date on the back of a folded flyer. December 10th, 2015. Service door open. That night, she didn't sleep. The next morning, she called someone she hadn't spoken to in over a year, a retired detective named Frank Cates, who had once worked the case in its early days. He wasn't with the department anymore. He'd left on medical grounds. But he had always taken her seriously. He had met with her when others wouldn't. And even after his retirement, he had told her, "If anything changes, call me." Janet sent him a photo of the door, taken quickly from her phone. The metal was rusted at the hinge. The frame looked warped. The signage above had been removed. But what caught Frank's attention wasn't the condition. It was that no one had reported it. There were no repair orders, no tenant complaints, and no explanation for why it had been reopened. Frank made a few quiet calls to former colleagues still on the force. No new searches had been authorized. No known work orders matched that location. One officer agreed to accompany Janet back the next day for a walkthrough, but by the time they arrived, the door was sealed again, painted over, like it had never happened. Janet felt her throat close when she saw it. The officer shrugged, told her it was probably just routine maintenance. Old buildings shifted, sometimes doors warped and popped open. She asked if he'd look behind it anyway. He declined. Without probable cause, there was nothing he could do, but Janet knew what she saw. She wrote it down again, added it to the timeline she kept in a box under her bed, a binder filled with annotated maps of Ridgeway Mall, security shifts, camera placement, dates of each camera outage she'd been told about, maintenance complaints logged and ignored. She'd begun compiling it 2 years earlier, during the months when no detective returned her calls. It wasn't official, but it was all she had. And that door, the one she swore had been sealed, was marked in red now. By 2016, Ridgeway Mall was nearly empty. A few chain pharmacies, one gym, a kiosk selling prepaid phones. It was quiet, hollow. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead even when no one walked beneath them. And still, Janet came. Every week, new flyers, new notes. She told no one, but she started walking past that door every visit, listening for sound, checking the paint, measuring the gap at the bottom with the toe of her shoe. Because somewhere inside this building, she still believed something had been missed, something that could answer the question no one else wanted to ask anymore. What if Layla never left the building because someone never meant for her to? By 2018, Ridgeway Mall was barely alive. Of the few businesses that remained, most were operating on short-term leases. Escalators had been shut down to save power. The heating system only worked in certain wings. Layla Hart had been missing for 7 years. Her flyers were gone. Her name rarely came up. The cold case remained technically open, but no new leads had emerged in years. Then, that summer, a real estate development firm called Braden and Keller finalized the purchase of the property. Their plan was to demolish Ridgeway Mall and build a mixed-use complex, residential units, retail, office space, clean slate. Before demolition could begin, structural inspectors were brought in. They walked every inch of the property, documenting hazardous material, load-bearing elements, buried utilities. In early July, during a routine wall integrity test near the old cinema wing, a team struck something unexpected. A hollow section behind layered drywall. They removed a portion of the plaster and found a metal door, bolted shut. No signage, no handle, just rust and age. Behind that door was a concrete stairwell, descending into darkness. The crew halted work immediately. They notified the developers, who in turn contacted local authorities. Within days, an investigative team was on site. The stairwell led to a sub-level no one had seen in decades. It wasn't listed on any current building blueprints. Not even older city records acknowledged it in detail. Just vague references to a lower mechanical area tied to original 1970s construction. At the bottom of the stairwell, investigators found a service corridor, flooded ankle-deep with stagnant water. Parts of the floor had collapsed. Wires hung loose from ceilings. Old conduit and ventilation shafts jutted from the walls like veins. Along the corridor were sealed rooms, some empty, some partially caved in. One appeared to have housed electrical panels, another looked like long-abandoned storage. The last room was different. Inside, behind a rusted grate, sat the lower entrance to the freight elevator system. It was directly beneath the shaft where Layla had last been seen. The elevator hadn't serviced that level in years. The pit was filled with debris, water, broken beams. Its bottom was unreachable without heavy equipment. Investigators noted the corroded doorframe, the warped metal, the structural instability. But they also noted something else. A chair. Old, metal, bolted to the wall in the corner. Next to it, a decayed paper log taped to a clipboard, so water damaged the ink had bled into illegibility. On the wall beside it, faint graffiti, markings in black permanent marker smeared over time. One word could still be read. Listen. Cadaver dogs were brought in, but the flooding limited their access. They alerted once, briefly, near the edge of the elevator pit, but the signal was too weak to validate. Ground-penetrating radar showed several anomalies beneath the shaft floor, but investigators were told the ground had shifted so much over time that old machinery could explain the results. No human remains were found, no personal belongings, no physical evidence linked directly to Layla. But everyone involved felt the weight of something. The photos from the discovery circulated online almost immediately. Blogs picked up the story. Reddit threads reignited. Theories surged again. And in the middle of it all, buried in the comment section of a YouTube video summarizing the find, was a message that didn't belong. It came from a user under the name JLo74. The account had no profile picture, no uploads, no history, just one comment. You weren't supposed to open that. It was flagged by several viewers, but before it could be removed, another appeared, this time on a forum dedicated to cold cases. She heard the wrong thing. They never fixed the floor. Some dismissed it as a troll. Others recognized the screen name. It matched an old email handle linked to a man who'd once worked maintenance at Ridgeway Mall. Jeff Loring. His name hadn't come up publicly in years, not since he'd quit and left the state back in 2011. But now he was back, online at least. Investigators attempted to trace the IP address, but it had been routed through multiple VPNs. The account went dark within 24 hours. Detectives reopened that portion of the investigation, quietly. They contacted Loring's last known employer out west. He was no longer there. No forwarding address. The trail went cold again, but what he wrote couldn't be ignored. She heard the wrong thing. They never fixed the floor. What did she hear? What floor? Theories erupted. Some believed there had been another crime down there, one Layla had accidentally witnessed. Others thought she'd been lured, that someone knew about the sublevel and used it, a perfect place to hide something. Or someone. The developers continued with demolition prep, but local authorities now required a full excavation of the lower elevator shaft before final permits would be released. It would take months. The area had to be drained, stabilized, and mapped. By then, media attention had moved on again. The news cycle was short, but Layla's mother never stopped watching. She read the comments, all of them, printed them out, handed them to the new detective on the case. She told him what she believed, that her daughter had been down there, somewhere beneath the mall all along, and maybe, just maybe, someone had known that for years. And they'd stayed quiet. Until now. On October 18th, 2023, at exactly 9:42 a.m., a backhoe operator paused his work and radioed his site supervisor. They had hit something that wasn't listed on the schematics. Again. Ridgeway Mall's demolition had already produced multiple surprises: dead-end corridors, filled-in ventilation shafts, wiring sealed behind double walls. But this was different. Near the base of the old freight elevator shaft, buried beneath a collapsed section of flooring and silt, was a saturated leather object wedged between two rusted beams. They stopped everything. An evidence tech arrived within hours. Under inches of foul-smelling water and soft sediment, they pulled out what remained of a women's handbag. The leather had nearly rotted through, and the strap disintegrated on contact, but the contents were mostly intact. Inside was a corroded compact mirror, a faded lipstick tube with the cap jammed on sideways, and a melted battery that once belonged to a Samsung flip phone. There was also a keyring with 2 house keys and 1 generic car key, rusted but still identifiable. Forensic specialists dried and cataloged the items. Within 48 hours, Layla Hart's family was contacted. Her mother confirmed the compact and lipstick matched those she'd carried. A partial serial number from the phone's circuit board matched Layla's last known mobile device. Forensics later confirmed trace DNA on the mirror handle was a familial match. It was hers. The discovery reignited everything. Media outlets ran updates for the first time in years. The Ridgeway Mall case, dormant and fading, was suddenly national news again. Interviews with Layla's family reappeared on nightly segments. Old footage of her smiling in a college hoodie played alongside drone shots of the mall being torn down in pieces. But the excitement of the discovery faded quickly into something heavier, something much more hollow. Because there was still no body. The pit of the elevator shaft had filled over the years. Water had seeped in through cracked foundation walls, mixing with rust, insulation, and shattered concrete. Below that, several feet of thick silt had formed a dense, uneven layer impossible to excavate without collapsing nearby walls. Structural engineers warned against further digging without major reinforcements. They couldn't just keep digging until they found something. Not safely. Cadaver dogs were brought in and lowered into the sublevel one at a time. The first showed interest at the base of the shaft. The second gave a clear alert. But the location was so deep into waterlogged debris that no physical remains could be recovered. A third dog gave no signal at all. It was inconclusive. Still, to the police, the theory began to solidify. Layla may have fallen or been pushed into the shaft that night. Whether she was conscious or already injured, they couldn't know. The shaft's lower level had no emergency lighting. If she'd fallen there, she wouldn't have been able to call for help. Not from the bottom. And by the time someone might have searched, water would have already started to rise. But that theory came with new questions. If it had been accidental, how did she get in? If it had been deliberate, who closed the door behind her? And why, for over a decade, had that purse been completely missed? A secondary scan was ordered using ground-penetrating radar. It showed several irregularities beneath the base of the shaft. Voids, debris clusters, possibly large metal fragments from structural collapse. Nothing that definitively indicated human remains. Authorities decided to suspend the search until conditions could be made safer. No timeline was offered. Layla's mother didn't ask for one. She flew under the radar during the renewed media interest. No interviews, no comments. But she did visit the site once. Quietly. She stood on a temporary platform overlooking what was left of the shaft and looked down into the water below. Workers stepped aside. A forensic tech handed her the compact mirror in a sealed case. She held it only once before giving it back. No one had seen her cry. But she wasn't the same after that day. In her mind, something had shifted. The grief was no longer theoretical. Something real had finally surfaced. And yet, it wasn't enough. Detectives didn't rule out foul play. The open corridor door, the glitched camera, the emergency call, the sublevel no one remembered. It all pointed to something more than an accident. But after 14 years, even strong suspicions start to decay. Witnesses disappear, paper trails get buried, and the person most often named in online theories, Jeff Loring, remained missing. Authorities attempted to contact him again. His last known address led to a mailbox in rural Nevada. No phone, no employment records, no social security activity in years. They sent formal inquiries to law enforcement agencies across 3 states. Nothing came back. So they were left with only what they had: a leather purse, a melted phone, and a pit filled with silence. There would be no press conference, no arrest, no closure. Just the quiet understanding that part of Layla had been found, and the rest of her might still be buried under 30 years of concrete and water. Somewhere in that pit, beneath the beams and rust and years of unanswered questions, lay a moment in time no one could undo. A bag, submerged and silent for over a decade, was the first thing to float to the surface. The rest of the truth, if it ever existed, still hadn't. 12 years after Layla Hart vanished inside Ridgeway Mall, a volunteer archivist in a small, windowless office heard something no one else had bothered to hear. His name was Aaron Greeley, 31 years old. Former AV technician, not a cop, not a journalist, just someone who'd become fascinated with cold cases after a brush with jury duty the year prior. He'd started volunteering part-time with a non-profit organization that digitized and preserved unsolved case records. mostly audio and analog media from backlogged police departments. He didn't expect to find anything meaningful. He just wanted to help catalog what no one else had time for. In August 2023, while converting Ridgeway Mall's archived security logs and related files into digital storage, Aaron came across an old .wav file labeled Emergency Elevator Line 040211. It had been logged by mall security the night Layla disappeared. 23 seconds long. It had been dismissed in the original case file as a probable prank, a call from inside the South Corridor elevator that came in at 8:16 p.m., almost 4 hours after Layla was last seen. He didn't think much of it at first, but protocol required reviewing all audio for clarity and digital preservation, so he put on headphones and hit play. What came through was mostly static, garbled frequency drops, dead space, but at 0008 there was a faint sound, a voice, almost buried. He played it again, slowed it down, ran a cleanup filter. Something was there. He enhanced it layer by layer, cleaned the noise, adjusted for distortion, boosted the treble band, and on the fifth pass, the voice came through, weak, strained, but undeniably human. Can anyone hear me? Pause. Can anyone... A metallic crash, a sound like something falling or hitting steel, then a scream. Short, echoed, then silence. Aaron froze. He checked the timestamp, April 2nd, 2011, 8:16 p.m., the same time listed in the original missing persons report. He read through the notes again. At the time, the call had been attributed to a likely prank. The audio hadn't been analyzed. No one had enhanced it. It had been filed, logged, and forgotten. He called his supervisor. The recording was flagged, labeled as a possible evidence discovery, and forwarded to the local precinct. By the end of the week, detectives reopened the file and sent the audio to a forensic sound analyst for official review. The results were inconclusive. The voice could be female. The words matched what Aaron had transcribed, but the distortion was still too high for vocal confirmation. There was no way to definitively say the voice belonged to Layla Hart. Still, the timing was impossible to ignore. She had entered the mall at 4:17 p.m. She was last seen at 4:44, walking toward the corridor outside the elevator. The call came from that elevator at 8:16 p.m., 4 hours later. No other person had been reported missing at Ridgeway that night. The mall had closed at 9 p.m. Security logs confirmed no staff used the elevator around that time. There was no evidence of unauthorized entry. No prank caller had ever come forward. The elevator, by then, had been decommissioned and partially destroyed during the first phase of demolition. The lower shaft had collapsed in on itself. The call system inside had long been removed. The button that triggered the emergency line, corroded, broken, had been found at the bottom of the pit. No useful prints. Still, it changed everything. The cold case unit reopened a formal review. Detectives who had worked the case early on were contacted. The original mall staff was tracked down. Most of them were gone, scattered across states. A few agreed to interviews. None remembered the emergency call being considered significant. Some didn't remember it at all. Janet Hart did. When the detective called her to say a new voice had been found, she didn't say anything for several seconds, just listened. Then she asked them to send the file. She played it alone in her kitchen, without her husband, without her son. Just her and Layla's old photograph, still sitting by the coffee maker where it had always been. She heard it too. The words were quiet, distorted, but she swore it was her daughter. The tone, the panic, it was exactly how she imagined Layla would sound if she were trapped, alone, desperate. She clutched the edge of the table when the crash came through, and when the scream hit, she dropped the phone. The audio was sent to a private forensic lab for further testing. Still, no confirmation. But something strange did happen. The independent lab found frequency interruptions that didn't match typical elevator interference. The distortion had peaks, like the sound was reverberating inside a narrow metal chamber, possibly a shaft. which meant the call wasn't made from the elevator. It may have been made from under it. Investigators considered this, if Layla had fallen or had been pushed into the elevator shaft. And if she had survived the initial fall, it was possible she'd reached up and pressed the emergency call button from the pit. That would explain the echo, the plea for help, the thud, the scream, the silence. But if she was down there, then she had been alive, and nobody had come. The guilt hit hard. It rippled through the department, through the community, through everyone who had once handled the case and moved on. Because back in 2011, that elevator had been marked out of service. It was assumed broken. No one had thought to test the emergency line. No one had thought to analyze the tape. And within weeks, the elevator had been restarted, cleaned, repaired, erasing everything it might have held. It became one of those rare cases where everyone involved had done exactly what protocol asked, and still missed the one thing that mattered. Layla had been calling for help, and they hadn't listened. The cold case unit issued an internal review. No new suspects were named. Jeff Loring's name returned to the table, but without forensic evidence or access to the shaft at the time, they had nothing to connect him. The excavation site remained too dangerous to explore further. Engineers warned that any deeper dig risked destabilizing surrounding infrastructure. The remains of the elevator shaft would be preserved as a historical safety hazard, but not excavated further. There would be no body, no charges, no trial. But there was the voice, and the family clung to it. Janet requested the enhanced audio on a flash drive. She didn't want the noise removed or the scream shortened. She wanted it exactly how it had been found. She listened to it every week, sometimes more. She kept it in a drawer next to the last voicemail Layla ever left her, a message from the morning of her disappearance, reminding her to pick up almond milk. The files didn't bring closure, they brought weight. But for the first time in over a decade, Janet no longer wondered whether Layla had vanished without trace. Because for 23 seconds her daughter had fought to be heard. And now she was. There's a theory, quietly held by the newer detectives, that she may have survived for hours, long enough to try calling, long enough to scream, but not long enough for someone to come. And if that theory is true, then it means Ridgeway Mall wasn't just a place where someone disappeared. It was a place where someone waited, and no one was listening. On March 11th, 2025, Ridgeway Mall was no longer a mall. What remained were skeletal walls, wind-exposed corridors, and an excavation site that looked more like a war zone than the shopping complex it once was. The Tinas place had gone quiet long ago. Empty storefronts had collapsed inward. Graffiti covered every exposed surface. Steel twisted in unnatural directions. The wrecking crews had done what time had started years earlier, erased it. The Ridgeway project had stalled for months while environmental studies and structural safety plans played out in city offices. But in early spring, after years of negotiations and setbacks, the final green light came through. It was time to bring the last section down, the central elevator shaft. It had been part of the original 1973 blueprint, an industrial-scale lift once used to move freight, mannequins, and seasonal displays between floors. Decades later, it had become outdated, eventually abandoned. After Layla Hart vanished in 2011, it had become something else entirely. A symbol, a theory, a place people pointed to but couldn't quite prove. By now, much of the lower foundation had been excavated. The freight shaft had been partially collapsed in previous phases, flooding the base and making deeper access impossible. Engineers had reinforced the top levels to prevent accidental collapse, but what they didn't expect was what came next. During a routine weld cut on a rusted beam lodged behind the back wall of the shaft, a structural anchor snapped free and part of the metal faceplate tore away. Behind it was concrete that didn't match any of the current demolition maps, just a pocket, a hidden cavity, no wider than 2 feet across. A worker crouched and looked inside with a flashlight. What he saw was colorless, sunless, and small. There was no door, no panel, just a narrow crawl space filled with layers of dust, shredded insulation, and at the far end, something lying half buried in debris. A piece of fabric. The site was shut down immediately. Investigators arrived within the hour. The state's cold case unit returned to the scene alongside forensic technicians. Over the next 3 days, piece by piece, the space was cleared. What they uncovered was what they had quietly feared, and what Layla's family had never stopped preparing for. The remains were skeletal, lying in a slightly curled position, back to the wall. Fabric fragments were tangled in what was left of her clothing, cotton, polyester blends, all consistent with what Layla had been wearing the day she disappeared. The hoodie was nearly disintegrated, but the faint outline of the embroidered logo on the chest could still be made out in one patch. A sunflower. Near her side were decayed rubber soles, the shape of her shoes intact though the material had rotted. A plastic hair clip snapped in half, and beneath what remained of her hip, the crushed metal frame of an old flip phone. Forensics moved slowly. The area was scanned, mapped, and sealed off with tarps. No one from the media was allowed within 20 feet. But word got out. 14 years after Layla Hart walked into Ridgeway Mall and never came out, her body had been found. Not in the lower shaft, not in the water, not under the freight platform, but in a dead space between the outer and inner shaft walls. A void that hadn't existed on any blueprint, one that hadn't been searched because no one had known it was there. The space wasn't accessible by hallway or stair. It had no panel, no vent, no access door. It appeared to have been created during a retrofit in the late 1980s when mechanical units were updated and reinforced with new beams. A corner of poured concrete had formed a blind cavity, a pocket that could trap debris, or in this case, someone trying to escape. Layla's remains were transferred to the state medical examiner's office. It took 3 weeks for the DNA confirmation, though her mother had already accepted the truth the moment the sunflower logo was mentioned. The cause of death was listed as undetermined. The bones showed signs of blunt trauma, likely from a fall. There was no evidence of sharp force injury, no bullet, no skull fracture severe enough to point to homicide. But the positioning of the body told its own story. Whoever she was when she entered that space, she had stayed there. Some experts believed she may have fallen down the shaft and ended up wedged behind the wall. That theory conflicted with others, who argued she had been placed there, or crawled in, seeking a way out. There were no definitive answers, only possibilities. Police re-examined earlier maps, original blueprints, structural reports. No one had documented the cavity. It wasn't part of the planned demolition, nor was it noted in any inspection prior. Even cadaver dog alerts in previous years had missed it, the scent blocked by concrete layers and stagnant air. If Layla had survived the fall, if she had been conscious, if she had made that emergency call from inside the elevator shaft just hours after she vanished, then the horrifying possibility emerged that she had remained alive for a time, trapped in the dark, waiting to be found. And she never was. Janet Hart received the call at 7:42 a.m. on April 2nd, 2025, 14 years to the day since her daughter disappeared. She sat alone on the edge of her bed, phone pressed to her ear, nodding quietly as the detective gave her the results. The words, confirmed, remains, blind shaft space, and skeletal washed over her like wind. When the call ended, she didn't cry. She walked to the fridge, took down the last remaining flyer she had printed, and folded it once. Then she put it in a drawer. The next day, she drove to the demolition site. She stood behind the barrier as crews in protective gear continued carefully clearing the debris. An officer brought her a small, sealed envelope with her daughter's hair clip inside. The metal was snapped. She ran her thumb across the edge, then handed it back. A press conference was held that afternoon. The police chief stood in front of the gathered cameras and used words like closure and dignity and tragic accident. No charges were filed, no arrests made. The name Jeff Loring was never mentioned. But online, the conversation surged again. People who had followed the case since the beginning posted tribute threads, breakdown videos, timelines. Theories returned. Had she been pushed? Had she witnessed something? Had someone known exactly where she was all along? The space she was found in sparked a new wave of speculation. Some believed only someone with insider knowledge could have accessed or used it. Others believed it was an architectural fluke, a tragic combination of missteps and bad timing. But the truth was, the only person who knew how she got there had died inside it. Layla's remains were cremated. Her family held a private service, no media, no eulogies, just a quiet gathering in a garden she once loved as a child. The Ridgeway Mall site was never fully redeveloped. Part of the land was designated as a memorial green space. A bronze plaque was installed near the former location of the freight elevator. It read simply, "In memory of Layla Hart. May no voice go unheard." There were no more flyers, no more weekly visits, no more theories to chase. But in the silence that followed, what remained was the most devastating truth of all, that she had never truly left that building. She had always been there, and they had been 14 years too late. On a gray morning in May of 2025, the last standing piece of Ridgeway Mall came down. It wasn't dramatic, no blast, no wrecking ball, just a slow collapse of scaffolding and old beams giving way under controlled machinery. The sound of it was hollow, metal scraping against concrete, glass crunching under steel treads, the dull echo of forgotten walls surrendering to time. The dust rose in sheets across the demolition site, and behind a chain-link fence stood a woman who had never stopped waiting. Janet Hart didn't speak to the reporters who hovered nearby. She didn't glance at the workers in yellow helmets or the police officer who nodded quietly in her direction. She just watched the final load-bearing wall fall, the one that had once connected the corridor where her daughter was last seen to the elevator shaft, where she was never found in time. A few feet from her, partially obscured by a folding tarp and framed with temporary barricades, stood a bronze plaque bolted to a slab of polished granite. It had been placed days earlier at the urging of the community and under pressure from city officials who knew the case had grown beyond its cold file. It was plain. No ornamentation, just a name, a date, and one short line etched in uppercase letters. Layla Hart, 1988 to 2011. She was here. No one argued with the wording, because that at least was now a fact. The official investigation closed shortly after the skeletal remains were identified. The medical examiner had labeled the death consistent with blunt force, trauma sustained from a fall. The cause remained officially undetermined. There was no conclusive evidence of homicide, no signs of restraints, no documented injuries beyond the trauma caused by the impact. But not everyone agreed with the closure. There were still the inconsistencies. A malfunctioning camera that glitched during the exact moment she vanished. A door left unlocked near a service hallway no one was supposed to use. An emergency call dismissed as a prank. The elevator itself, sealed, reopened, sealed again. The strange, silent corridor where cadaver dogs had alerted and investigators had found nothing. And of course, the space where she was finally discovered. An unlisted cavity behind the elevator shaft, wedged between layers of concrete and rusted rebar, where no search team had ever been told to look. The police issued a final statement. They called the case an unresolved fatal fall. They cited insufficient evidence to pursue a criminal investigation. They made no mention of Jeff Loring. His name was never spoken publicly, even as online communities swelled with accusations, timelines, and reconstructed 3D models of the mall interior. The Hart family, for their part, accepted the finality, but not the explanation. Janet believed then, and still believes now, that her daughter was led into that hallway. Maybe not violently, maybe not even forcefully, but led. She believes someone knew about that elevator, that space, that door, that silence, and that when Layla's voice came through the emergency call, pleading, distorted, unheard, it wasn't just fate or mechanical failure that sealed her in. It was human decision. But there would be no arrest, no charges, no confession, just silence. And a hallway that no longer exists. The mall was never rebuilt. Developers shifted focus after media attention stalled their project. Permits were pulled, blueprints were retracted, the land sat untouched for months. And then, quietly, a local nonprofit approached the city with a proposal. Instead of another retail complex, what if the space became a memorial green? A place to walk, sit, remember. The city approved it within a month. Construction was minimal. A few benches, native trees, a walking path that curved near where the South Corridor had once stood, where the elevator shaft had dropped into darkness. Janet returned often in those first few months. She never sat. Just walked the path in loops, pausing near the plaque, sometimes running her hand along its cold edge. Once she brought a candle, lit it, left it burning until the wind took it. Her son came once, stood at a distance, said nothing, left quickly. Her husband never visited, not once. The truth is, Layla's death didn't just bury her, it buried parts of all of them. Her father retreated into work and silence. Her brother moved states away. Janet stayed behind, haunted not just by what was lost, but by what was almost found. Because in the inusable end, it wasn't a witness or a tip or a break in the case that revealed what happened. It wasn't a new suspect or a confession scrawled on an old wall. It was concrete, shifting, collapsing, giving way under its own age and weight and failure. That's what finally told the truth, or at least part of it. The rest, how she ended up behind that wall, whether she crawled or was carried, whether someone waited until the right moment to disappear her into the quietest part of the mall, those questions were never answered, and maybe never will be. The documents were filed, the case marked inactive, but the name Layla Hart still echoes in cold case circles, in digital forums, in faded posters still pinned to corkboards in the back rooms of precincts where people don't like to admit they missed something. Because that's what the Ridgway case became, not a cautionary tale or a solved mystery, but a reminder that people don't always disappear with noise, that sometimes the loudest part of a tragedy is how quietly it unfolds, and that a hallway, an ordinary, poorly lit service corridor walked by 1,000 people before her, can become the last place anyone ever sees you. The last hallway she walked alone, and the one no one followed her into.